In this video, I wanted to once again introduce you guys to StratusForms, as well as show you how you can quickly and easily get started with StratusForms. For those of you not familiar, StratusForms is a free tool that allows you to create forms for SharePoint 2007, 2010, 2013, 2016, and in Office 365 as well. StratusForms is completely client-side based and allows you to create forms using simple HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. So you can use it to create super simple forms, or you can use it to create really complex forms as well with lots of business logic, calling other web services and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And StratusForms has been around now since about 2011, I want to say. I first created it for SharePoint 2010 because I completely hate InfoPath. And you should be start getting off of InfoPath now. If you're not getting off of InfoPath, you need to find some solution to get you off of it because it is going away. It's not where you should be moving your efforts and your technologies. So stop using InfoPath. All right, I'm off my soapbox about that for now. But anyway, I've done a couple of intro videos for StratusForms, and I keep trying to think of ways to make it easier and easier for you guys to get started. And just a couple of days ago, I released version 1.5 of StratusForms. And so I thought, well, let's do another video helping you get started and seeing how you can start creating forms for SharePoint. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll start from scratch and create a couple of forms. Okay. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go to the GitHub repository at github.com/mrackley/StratusForms. And from within there, you will find all of the files you need for StratusForms. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to download those files locally, like I've already done here. And we're going to take a closer look at these files after we go through and do a quick example. So I've downloaded all the files for StratusForms locally. And then here in my SharePoint Online site, and again, I'm using SharePoint Online, but you could do this with any version of SharePoint from 2007 on up. So what I've got in my SharePoint Online site, I've got my Site Assets document library. And within this Site Assets document library is where I'm going to put all of these StratusForms files. So I'm just going to highlight these files. I'm going to uncheck the .git files. Those are files that are used for the GitHub repository. We don't need those in our Site Assets library. So I'm just going to grab these files, drag them over here, and copy them. Now that the files are uploaded, there's only really two files that you need to make StratusForms work. And that's the StratusForms-1.5 file, which is the main StratusForms engine, and then the StratusForms-data file. And this is the file that's responsible for calling all the web services to add and update information into SharePoint. The rest of the files that you download are README files and examples. So if you're creating another form from scratch, all you need are these two StratusForms files. So let's go through and let's create the minimal form example. The minimal form example, that is the most simple form we can do. So what I'm going to do is I am going to now add a list to my site. So I'm going to add an app. And this is the list that is going to store our StratusForms forms. So I'm going to create a custom list, and because I'm doing the minimal example, I'm going to create the list name called minimal, but this list name can be whatever you want it to be. So let's go ahead and create this list. And now that this list is created, I need to do one thing to this list. I need to add one field, and that field needs to be a multiple lines of text field, and it needs to be a plain text field. So make sure you add a field that's minimal lines of text, that's plain text, and the name of this field needs to be StratusForms data. And this is the field that is going to hold all of our form data. What StratusForms does is it kind of does what InfoPath does. In InfoPath, you store all of your form data in an XML object. Well, StratusForms stores all of your form data in a JSON object, and that JSON object is stored in a field called StratusForms data. Now, from here, you can also promote fields to your list in SharePoint, just like you can with InfoPath. But again, we're starting with the very basics here to get you guys started. So create your list. In that list, create a field called StratusForms data that is a multi-lines of text field and a plain text field. Make sure it's plain text. And now we'll save that. And our list is set up. So we're now ready to start creating a StratusForms form. So to do that, I am going to go into my site contents and I'm going to create a page. In Site Pages, I'm going to create a web part page, and this is the page that's going to have my form on it. So I'll call this page StratusForms. But you can call it whatever you want to call it. Doesn't really matter. So let's create a page called StratusForms. And now to this page, I'm going to add a content editor web part. So under Media and Content, Content Editor. And now I'm going to edit this web part. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to point this web part to that file in my Site Assets library for the minimal example, which is under Site Assets, Minimal Form, and it's called minimal.js. So that's what I'm going to point this content editor web part to. So that's going to be under Site Assets / minimal form minimal.js. And so when the page loads, we see here we have a very simple form with just a single text box. But from here, we can go ahead and enter some text in this text box, say hello world, click on the button here, and it gives a little alert saying it created the entry successfully. And if we go and look at that minimal list, we can see that it actually did create an entry there with the StratusForms data field having the JSON object that contains that form information. Okay, so that easily you can get started with StratusForms. Upload the StratusForms files, create a list, add one field to that list called StratusForms data, and then create a page and put the script for the minimal example on that page, and you're pretty much good to go. Okay, so that's how you can get started. So let's take a closer look at those files for the minimal form example so you can see what's going on in those files, and then let's go through and let's make this form a little more complicated, because let's face it, that's a really ugly form with one field, and it's, you know, why would you ever want to use that for a form? So first thing let's do is let's open up that minimal.js file. And we look at this file, we can see that we are including a few scripts. We're using jQuery because that's one of it's necessary for StratusForms. And we're also using the SP Services library, which is a SharePoint Web Service library created by Mark Anderson. And that's because StratusForms is backwards compatible with SharePoint 2000 and 2010. It's because we're using SP services. Future versions of StratusForms will only work with SharePoint 2013 going forward, because we are in the process of converting that StratusForms data file into a REST-only library. But in its current inception, it does work on those previous versions of SharePoint. We're also referencing the StratusForms file and that StratusForms data file, which again is using SP services. The next thing we have is a div with an ID of SF form. And this div is going to be the div that holds our form on the page. It's like, where is that form going to live on the page? It's going to live in this div. And then we have two functions. And these are really the only two functions that you need for creating and displaying forms. We've got a function called StratusForms initialize, and this is a function that you want to execute whenever you want to initialize a form and either for someone to create a form or to display an existing form. And the parameters that you want to pass into this function, one of them is the HTML form, and this is the path to the HTML for your form. You want to pass in the query string variable, and this is if you're displaying an already existing item or editing an existing item. You need to tell StratusForms what's the name of the query string variable that's going to contain the ID of the list item. By default, we're using form ID. For default SharePoint forms, this value would be ID. And then you want to pass in the list name. What is the name of the list that you're going to be creating the form to or reading the form from? And in this case, we created that list with the name of minimal. We then have this complete function, and that is going to be, what do you want to do after the page is done loading? So you could do some post-processing within this complete function to do things like set up date pickers, do some additional formatting, custom web services, whatever you want to do. So this gets executed after the page is done loading. So this is the initialization function, and then we have a submit function. And this is the function you need to execute in order to save a form. And all you need to pass into this submit function is the name of the list you're saving to, and then what do you want to do again after the form is done saving. So in our examples, when the form is done saving, I'm going to pop up an alert to the user saying the save was successful, and then I'm going to reload the page. But you can delete these two lines if you don't want to do anything after the page is loaded. Okay, so we have an initialize function that says where are we reading the data from, and then a submit function saying where are we going to be storing that information to. And that's really the only two functions you need. So let's take a look at that HTML file to see what that looks like, which is going to be the HTML file that actually makes up the form. So we look at the minimal.html file, we can see it literally is just HTML. We have an input that is of type text, and that is going to hold that title field we had, and then we have a button that is just executing that submit form function that we had from the JavaScript file. So the only thing that you need to be careful of when you're creating a form in StratusForms is that every field have a unique ID. Because that JSON object I create, it uses the ID of the input to store that data. So you can create a form as crazy big as you want to with hundreds of fields and crazy business logic, but it's very important that every element have a unique ID on that form. You'll also see that we've got this other parameter for this title field, which is list field name. Now, if you want to promote a field to a SharePoint list field, what you do is you set this attribute called list field name, and you give it the internal field name of the SharePoint list field that you want to promote this field to. So in this minimal example, we're taking this text field and we're going to promote it to the title field. So if we look at that all items list for the entry we created, we see that we have in that JSON object this title field equal to hello world, but hello world was also promoted to the title field in the SharePoint list. And that's because we set up this attribute that said list field name equals title. Okay, so now that we have that, why don't we make this form a little bit nicer? So I'm not a good designer, so I've been looking online for something that you could do as a good example. And I found this HTML for something called contact form, HTML5 contact form. And in this, this person created this contact form that's got HTML and CSS. And I want to show you guys that we can take this form, this example, which has nothing to do with SharePoint, and get it working within our SharePoint site. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take the HTML, and let's just copy this HTML. And then let's open up this minimal HTML file here, and let's overwrite the input fields. I want to keep my submit button because that's how we're going to save the form, and then paste in that HTML. And then I want to take my submit button and I want to overwrite their button. You don't want to use an HTML button with StratusForms because that causes a form postback, and we don't want to be doing form postbacks. We want to let SharePoint handle the REST queries handle the saving and reading of the data. So I recommend using just a regular input of type button or anything really. You could use a div or a span or anything else to execute your submit function, but this is what I'm going to use. Now we have all these fields, and again, the thing I told you is that these fields need to have unique IDs. So let's go ahead and put in some IDs for these first. So I'm going to put an ID of name for this field. We'll do an ID equals email for this field. We'll do ID equals phone for this field. ID equals message or URL, and then ID equals message. Okay, so again, all these elements have to have unique IDs. You can call them whatever you want to, just make sure they're unique. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. The other thing I want to do is I want to get the CSS in there. So there's a CSS block. Now I can either save this CSS to a different file, or I can put it inline in my script. So I'm just going to put it inline into my form over here. So let's just put our CSS inline. So I'm going to do style type equals text /CSS /style, and then I'm just going to copy and paste the style from that. Come on. Okay. So nothing up my sleeve, right? You saw me do everything. I've got the HTML for the form. I gave it a unique ID, and then I've got the CSS to make it look nicer. So now I'm going to save this. And we go back into our pages now. I can open up our form again. And now you see we have this nice contact form, right? So this is the same list, we didn't add any other fields to the list or anything. We can go through and fill out our form. So I can say Mark Rackley is my name. My email address is mrackley@gmail.com. And let's set up a phone number. It's going to be 501-555-1212. My website, markrackley.net. And my message, StratusForms is not too shabby. Okay, now when I save this, it says it was successful. Say OK. And the page reloads with the data, and you can see all the forms, the fields are still filled out. Just so you know there's no trick up my sleeve, let me delete this query string variable up here. Reload the page. You can see it's a blank form. Now let's have it load the form again with the ID of 2. And it loads it, and there's the form data. If we go look at that list now again, which is the minimal list, we can see that we have that StratusForms data object that has all of that data in it. And you can see it did not promote any field to the title field because we didn't tell it to. So if we want to have it put the person's name in that title field, we could come back into the form, which is right here. And I can go into that first name field, and I can give it that attribute of list field name equals title, which means, hey, I want you to promote the first name field to the title field in the SharePoint list. And we'll save that. And now if I come back, open up the page, and do another test here, my test, and now I save it. Now when I go back and look at that list, we see that the first name field got promoted to the title field. Okay, so this is how you get started with StratusForms, right? You create your HTML forms, you give them unique IDs, you execute the initialize function to load it and the submit function to save it. When you promote fields, use that list field name attribute. Now I do recommend when people start creating really complicated forms, don't go through and promote all of your fields at once. Just get the basic field form working. And then if you need to promote fields, promote them one at a time to your SharePoint list fields. That seems to be the point at which people have the most issues because of all the different field types. Some fields aren't completely supported. Managed metadata fields, for example, are not supported. If you want to promote a person field to a SharePoint list person field, you have to make sure you're using actual person field on your form itself. It can't be just a text box. So there's a few things you have to take into account when you start promoting those fields. So when you're getting started with StratusForms, I would suggest creating your form just like we did here. Go as crazy and complex as you want to, but get the form working before you go to start work through and start promoting all your fields. So I'm going to try to start keeping this up with more videos for you guys, show you how we can enhance the form, use some of their functionality. There's a ton of functionality within StratusForms. Not all of it's documented. You can do things like digital signatures. There's a rich text box. You can encrypt data. You can do repeating content. There's people pickers, like I said. So there's a lot of stuff there. And hopefully you can get started. Hopefully you can jump in there and play with it. If you have suggestions for things you want to see or do, let me know. We have a Slack channel. So if you email me at info@stratusforms.com, I can get you added to our Slack team so you can get involved there asking questions and making suggestions. And there you go. So just go to the GitHub at github.com/mrackley/stratusforms, download the files, look at the examples, and start playing around. Thanks a lot.